War and combat. War films never go out of style. Over the past 100 years, there have been some changes and many constants. For the historian, war films can be both a dramatization of historical events and a record of changing cultural attitudes towards those events. This is a chart that shows how many American films have been made about some of our wars. As you can see, the films about World War II outnumber all other U.S. wars combined, with about 115 films made for every year the U.S. was involved. Why have there been so many films for some conflicts and so many for some of the others? These are some of the reasons. Winning is more entertaining than losing, and the Allies had a clear victory in World War II. The clarity of good versus evil. World War II was fought over clear moral issues as well as territory and political power. How many people served in the war? How many families were affected? The more participants, the greater the audience because the people are more interested in conflicts that involve someone they know. Finally, how does the war make us feel about ourselves as a nation? Most Americans, and most other Allied nations, still view Americans as the heroes of World War II, but we're more conflicted about our role in other wars. Like Westerns, you have clear heroes and villains and plenty of action. Characters under stress is a good framework for psychological or relationship stories. The audience is likely familiar. It's easier to tell a World War II story than a Balkan War because we already know the context. War is inherently cinematic. Epic conflict, spectacular effects, dramatically important on two scales, both political and personal. There's an endless supply of source material because there have always been, and will always continue to be, more wars. War stories have great villains. Hitler needs no backstory. Uniforms do the work. We are already emotionally invested. It's easy to identify the good guys and the bad guys. War films support our own stories of victories and losses, as a nation and in our own families. Most of us do not know any aliens, superheroes, or international secret agents, but most of us do know a soldier or a veteran and can relate to how the character in the war can relate to the characters in a war film. Writing national mythology is important. Understanding our international conflicts is important in forming our American identity. What makes a war or combat story? We're not talking about films and novels set during the time of war, or with war as a backdrop, such as Gone with the Wind or War and Peace. A personal story taking place during war is not what we're looking at here. War or combat stories need soldiers and battles. They are often mission-specific. They take place in a closed world with little backstory. There's usually a sense of greater purpose, or lack of purpose, than the average action film. War stories are typically male-dominated. Masculinity is a primary element in American filmmaking, more so than the national film output of other countries. This includes westerns, war, and action. In fact, the biggest western stars of the post-war era, Eastwood and Wayne, also made a lot of war movies. What does it mean to be a man? Masculinity is an important aspect of our national mythology. War stories provide a framework to explore themes of brotherhood, honor, bravery, risk-taking, and self-sacrifice. In addition to action, war stories often feature complex, conflicted characters and relationships. What makes a successful war story is investment in the characters, because you should already know how the war itself turned out. War films tend to reflect the politics of the period they were made in, even more so than other films, which makes them rich cultural resources for looking back on the customs, language, prejudice, and politics of a particular period. Although historians can glean a lot from popular songs and literature of the 17th and 18th century America, film had not yet been invented during the Revolutionary, Civil, or other smaller wars and conflicts of our early history. Cinema was just developing during World War I, so there were no war films actually made during the conflict. The first World War I film was the silent The Big Parade in 1925, made 8 years after the war ended. The first big war film with sound is All Quiet on the Western Front, made in 1930. The theme of World War I stories is usually war is hell. accentuating the pointless misery blamed on ambitious national leaders. This reflects the general disillusionment and anti-war sentiment of America after the Great War. In contrast, films made during World War II were aimed at boosting morale, explaining the conflict and illustrating the war experience to the folks back home. Virtually every American had family and friends in the military or was involved in some type of war work, even down to buying war bonds, and collecting recycling, fat, rubber, metal for the war effort. So audiences were hungry for war dramas, war comedies, war romance, war documentaries. Hollywood played an important role in the U.S. war propaganda, or what we would call messaging today. Many of the biggest film stars left their careers to enlist in the military, or to otherwise help the war effort. Even today, World War II films almost exclusively show the war as necessary and heroic on the part of the Americans. In contrast, there was almost no films about the current war made during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. People were tired of war and war movies and conflicted or ambivalent about the conflict, if not actually actively anti-war. The film MASH was made during Vietnam, but set in Korea. It depicts war as ridiculous. It introduced an era of cynicism, criticism, and regret that dominated war films for decades to come. During the current wars, most films have been critical of the war. Have you seen any of these films? Probably not. Films about our current wars have done very poorly at the box office. No one wants to see them. They are political and harshly critical, not heroic, and not much fun. The few successful films from the current wars show heroism and brotherhood, but in a very downbeat way. Films made about these current wars 30 years from now may have a different perspective than they do now. Consider how 70 years has changed the attitudes towards the Japanese. Once considered a mass of soulless assassins, we are now more comfortable considering their individual humanity and motivation. War films can be loosely divided into several categories. First, the patriotic or good war. These developed over World War II and focus on individual heroism, brotherhood, and sacrifice for the good of the cause. These stories feature a clear enemy and a righteous cause. They often include a cross-section of representative Americans, the guy from Brooklyn, the farm kid with a girl back home, and an immigrant proud to fight for his adopted nation. These films often feature why we are fighting speeches about honor and duty. In battle-specific combat stories, historical and technical accuracy is important. These films include lots of characters and tactical detail. These detailed stories make an even better books than films. Black Hawk Down is a confusing film, but a great book detailing every minute of the battle from multiple points of view. World War I, Vietnam, and our current conflicts are often depicted in anti-war or political war films. In these stories, war is run by politicians and profiteers without clear divides between allies and enemies. The American soldier is the victim more than the hero. In psychological war stories, the effect of war on the psyche of the individual soldiers drives the plot. The moral is, war makes you crazy, and only crazy people make war. War comedies can be anti-authority, morale-boosting fun, or cynically anti-war. Most of these focus on bureaucracy rather than combat. Here's what you should be looking for as you work on this week's assignment. Point of view. Is it a sweeping overview of the war or one soldier's story? Is it pro-war or anti-war? How is the enemy portrayed? As a noble rival or as a subhuman pest? Is the emphasis on a personal story, brotherhood, the greater cause, or a specific battle? Is the structure heroic, psychological, tactical, political, or comic? What ideals of nationalism and masculinity does it celebrate or criticize? And of course, could you use this book or film to teach history?